A little background, this manifesto was written out of a conference, a small meeting of the minds of about 20 or 25 software development folks in 2001. So they had all been talking to each other for a few years and comparing how they were doing things. And so the manifesto was basically created as a document where we all agree that these are the things that are important in building good software and creating value for our clients. And so that's kind of what the idea behind the manifesto is. And I think that we could actually look at it in terms of whatever work that we're doing and translate it so it doesn't just have to be about software, right? So as I mentioned in the first part of the talk, the first of the four main principles is very clearly about respecting people. The idea that there's value, as they say in the bottom of the manifesto there's value in items on the right, the white text, but we value the items on the left a little bit more. So we do have processes and tools in Agile, but we will optimize for interactions and talking to people, having conversations, working things out like humans over relying always on the processes and the tools. That's really at the core of Agile. So it's not that we don't have processes, we certainly do. And it's not that we don't use tools, we of course do. But if you can have a conversation to resolve some ambiguity or conflict, do the conversation first. Don't just rely on the process, right? So that's kind of the key here. And you can apply that to any organization in any kind of work. The second one, you could just simply replace working software with whatever the completed product or experience that you're responsible for bringing to the world, whatever it is, working product, working outcomes, something on the left there is basically, what is the outcome that you want to generate for the business? We value that outcome over the comprehensive documentation of what we originally said we were going to do, right? So it's really about the customer experience is key here, not just the documentation for our own purposes internally, right? And collaboration with customers is more important than contract negotiation. That comes from software developers who would originally have to define in painstaking detail every little thing that they were going to build in the software. We now know that software development doesn't work that way. It's extremely difficult to define in advance all of the possible permutations that a piece of software might need to go through. And so instead, we optimize for talking to the customer regularly. And the customer might be an internal stakeholder in your organization. It doesn't have to be the end customer. It could be your boss. We're going to show the boss what we're building so far, iteration by iteration, instead of having the boss required or the customer required to specify every single thing you're going to want in advance, and then we'll build it. No. We're going to build in little pieces, and we're going to show you, and you're going to say, oh yeah, I like that, or no, that's not quite right, and then we'll adapt, which leads right to the fourth principle there of responding to change over following a plan. I almost don't feel like I really need to talk about that one that much. It's so straightforward, but of course the idea is, things are constantly changing and they're only changing faster every year. And so we need to be able to adapt and not just stick to the plan because we said we were going to. All right. So I want to walk through, just so that you get really up close exposure to the three main Agile methods that are out there and their different purposes and how you might use them or borrow elements from them for your project, right? So I referenced Kent Beck, who was one of the signatories on the Agile Manifesto. His book, Extreme Programming, came out in 1999. It was one of the first books that I encountered when I first became a programmer. And what's really nice about it is it's got all of the technical practices from software development that made it into Agile This is where a lot of the technical practices come from. But again, it can be extended to other non-software work. And I have a series of principles I'll show you in a few slides in the future that show you how to apply the general principles regardless of whether you're doing software or not. But for the moment, let's look at this as a software project, right? So extreme programming is ideal for when you're working on something where you don't really know everything that you're going to build in advance. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's a little bit more like a creative or discovery process. And so when extreme programming was first defined, the idea was the customer would come to the office with the software developers and would be there and be available to answer questions or give feedback really at any time, right? So that's a pretty revolutionary idea, having the customer sit there and watch you build software and be a participant in the process. But that's basically about as tight of a feedback loop between the customer and the team as you could possibly get, right? They also instituted this concept of test-first development, or sometimes known as TDD, test-driven development. And the idea is simply that the software is being tested little bit by little bit continuously as you write it. So you write the test first, and what that gives you is instant feedback if there's a bug. If you write the wrong code, the tests will fail, and you'll know in seconds that you just made a mistake, and you can quickly back out of it. That is quality control at a level of speed that I don't even think Deming would have dreamed of. But it's pretty magnificent when you're writing code to work in this way. And related to that, developers tend to write, bigger projects these days with lots of people contributing code. And so that code needs to be merged together, and the program needs to be tested with everyone's changes in it all together in order to make sure that the whole thing works. And you can imagine software a little bit like if you were writing the next great novel and you were trying to write it with 150 people, each writing a different chapter, everyone responsible for a different page or a different paragraph, and you had to constantly merge it all together, and the book had to read and have a good story and actually make sense. And the publisher kept changing their mind every month about whether the book was going to be fiction or nonfiction or a mystery or an adventure. Like, that's kind of what it feels like to write software development. Imagine writing a book with 150 other people, right? And it all has to make sense. So merging code and checking the continuity of the whole project continuously rather than just at the end is really, really important. So XP is really about being able to apply Agile principles when it's more of a discovery process and you're not really sure what the end result needs to be, right? The more common Agile framework that's become very dominant is called Scrum, developed by Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. And it's a little bit more effective for when you're building a large project with pretty clear definition. And it's a little bit more related to the team and management structure and less about the technical practices. A lot of Agile teams in the software world will combine both Scrum and XP. The developers will use XP on their day-to-day work in the code, and the management structure around them will be Scrum-like, right? So that's where you get working in sprints, having a daily Scrum or a daily stand-up meeting to check in, and then having these regular retrospectives. So you can see that these team practices are designed to keep everyone coordinated and aligned. And that, for that reason, Scrum is often really good for projects that aren't software, that are not technical, because there's nothing stopping you from having a daily check-in. There's nothing stopping you from having retrospective meetings about once a month to look at the process and make improvements. And there's nothing usually stopping you from taking a large set of work and breaking it down to smaller batch sizes, right? And then we have the third most popular Agile framework called Kanban method, which is most closely related to Toyota and Lean. It's not exactly the same, but it's really originates from that work. And it's more of a meta framework. By that, what I mean is if you apply the Kanban method, it's a set of practices that help you design your own process rather than following an exact process. So in Kanban, the idea is we're focused more on the flow of work, not on the individual tasks of any particular person on the team. We're always looking at our visual control board where all the work is listed to see, are things getting done? Is work flowing through the system? And you can start with Kanban from what you're already doing. There's no sort of big bang training reorganization process. All you have to do with Kanban is to analyze and write down what the steps of your current process is and put it up on the board so that all the work is visible to everyone, and start working and using these recurring meetings or retrospectives as well to see if you can slightly improve the process, every week or every month, right? So the key metric for Kanban is cycle time. That's the time it takes from an item of work to go from the beginning of the process to the end of the process and be delivered to a customer, right? So we're measuring the flow through the system and focusing on the work and making sure all work is visible, that everybody can see the work. It's not getting stuck in between work steps. And if at all possible, we're removing bottlenecks. So that's where work would get stuck in a process and pile up into a big queue. So Kanban is really appropriate for very complicated processes where it's not very easy to see how you would instantly change over to Agile Scrum, for example. You can take Kanban into a place where the flow of work is seemingly at random. So it's a lot of little different tasks every day. I put in the examples here, maybe DevOps or IT, support or sales, where you're not doing one big project that needs to be broken into pieces, but rather just day-to-day different stuff is coming in the inbox and needs to be processed and put in the outbox. Kanban is usually particularly good for those kinds of systems, right? So it's an evolutionary approach, right? So we had a question about OKRs, and I wanted to point out also that Agile plays really well with its cousins, some of the other frameworks that are very innovative and exciting, right? So I've given you three of the most dominant frameworks that organizations are also applying at the same time that they're applying Agile. And if you can get all of these working together in concert, it can produce really incredible outcomes, right? So the lean startup methodology, which I didn't include in the first part of the talk, but I often do. We've got whole talks on lean startup by itself, is a method for being able to validate a business idea by talking to customers in an iterative fashion before you invest in building the solution. So it's a way of pushing the experimentation idea out to user research and market testing before you build some complicated solution, right? So lean startup and Agile, they work really well together. You can use lean startup to test and validate a signal in the market. Is this what customers really want? Is this a problem they actually have? And you can use Agile to begin building the solution bit by bit as you're gathering that feedback from customers. Design thinking also fits really well with Agile. Design thinking is all about a discipline of having user or customer empathy built into the design process, making sure that we're doing prototypes and early versions and getting users feedback and testing with users early so that we don't produce a user interface or a design that's really clunky and hard to use and customers hate it, right? So if you combine design thinking and lean startup and Agile together into a cross-functional team, it can be really powerful. And then OKRs, originally, I believe, developed by John Doerr at IBM, at Intel, and popularized by Google, is a way of aligning everyone to a common strategy or set of strategies so that people are focused more on objectives that are business outcomes. And so the different departments of an organization can have their OKRs that are aligned and feed up into a set of general company objectives that everyone is trying to target for their work, right? So it's aligning all the teams into a common strategy. OKRs are a little hard to get right? Like lots of companies hear the idea, they read the book, and kind of struggle to pick the right ones. In general, with most metrics, it's best to have fewer rather than more, and to have them be really about the business outcomes as much as possible, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in the questions at the end. So the last bit of this slide share is I want to help you think about how you would actually design your own framework using all of these principles that we've discussed. And so I've given you 7 major principles that you can apply whether you make software or not, that should help you build a process that's very agile and incorporates many of the other ideas that we talked about. And I've got we're going to drill down into each of these 7 in future slides. So just let me iterate them for you. We've got reducing batch size ruthlessly. We're measuring the right things, measuring what matters. We make all work visible so that everybody can see what's going on. We plan our outcomes to our actual capacity based on the people we actually have and how busy they are. We try to minimize dependencies between teams as much as possible. And we try to reduce the number of handoffs from one process to the next in our overall workflow. And then finally, we want to encourage fast feedback, ultimately from the customer, but also within the process as well, right? So reducing batch size is probably the single most powerful and important thing that you can do. It basically comes down to don't do too many things at the same time. Try to do a small number of things, right? So when you have a big, complicated process, it's very tempting to hand large batches of things to the next person and have them work through those, right? So if I were a designer and you were a programmer and we had to build an application that had 100 different pages on it, if I designed all 100 pages and it took me, a couple of months to do that, and I handed you the pages of all 100, the designs of all 100 pages, and then you as the programmer started to build those designs, and you found on page 2 that there was a mistake that carried through all of the remaining 98 pages. I'd have to go back and start all over and fix that mistake on all 100 designs and then hand them back to you again. It would be an enormous waste, an enormous amount of rework. If instead I just designed the first 1 or 2 or 3 pages and handed them to you in a small batch to start working on, you could discover that defect right away before I get too far into my batch and save us both a lot of time and money, right? So a small batch from Lean and Agile is really the number one thing. It was really the key contribution that Taiichi Ono from the Toyota production system focused on, is reducing the batch size between processes as much as possible, because that increases flow and it increases the speed of time to market, time to the customer, right? Large batches encourage waste. Large batches reduce quality. And when there's a problem in the system, large batches can exacerbate that problem exponentially, not linearly. It gets worse very, very quickly and just grows with time, right? So small batches then help support the remaining 6 that we're going to go over, right? And you'll see how. Our second one about measurement is that we want to try to favor outcomes over outputs. This means that we are not focused on how many activities or tasks we're doing, but we're actually being measured on what the business outcomes we're trying to achieve really are. So let's say in sales, it might be tempting to say, I'm going to give myself a pat on the back because I made 100 phone calls today or this week, but rather we want to focus on closed deals, right? Instead of the number of activities. So outputs are just what are all the things that people are doing and making. Outcomes are really why we're doing them, what we're trying to achieve. So measurements at all, if at all possible, should focus on outcomes. It's also more useful to use rates and ratios or percentages or numbers over time rather than just absolute totals. And we want to be able to understand the difference between a leading indicator and a lagging indicator, right? So a leading indicator might be we're trying to attract people to our marketplace. Visitors that land on the page from some advertising would be a leading indicator. It's not useless. We would want to look at that if we're testing the effectiveness of our advertising. A lagging indicator would be how much revenue did we make from purchases on the marketplace last month? That would be a lagging indicator, right? And so they both have different uses, and it's important to be really clear about how we're setting up our measurements and how they interrelate, right? So small batches also make the metrics more accurate. If we're trying to measure everything in large batches, we have less fine-grained resolution metrics. The third piece on visualizing work is another big contribution from Lean, from Toyota, from Deming, which is we need to be able to see what we're doing, particularly when we're doing knowledge work of any kind of creative process, right? So if we're doing design, if we're doing any kind of software engineering, if we're building systems, a lot of time the inventory will actually be invisible because it'll be digital assets sitting on a disk drive somewhere, right? And so if you can't see the inventory, you have to use a system like a Kanban board or a project management tool like Jira or Trello or Microsoft Project or something, so that you can see all the work and everyone can see where things are getting stuck in the system in queues. So a queue is something that forms between two steps in the process, right? It's like when I was describing that example of the designer who makes a bunch of pages and hands them over to the developer. That stack of pages that the developer is not ready to start on yet, that's a queue. Got a bunch of unfinished work that's just sitting in a wait state. It's just waiting to be touched. And as it's sitting there, it's costing us all money, right? So we want to try to reduce queues as possible, and using a work visualization can help us make sure that we spot queues before they form, right? And so making work visible also reduces the need for micromanagement and decision by committee. Because if we're able to broadcast updates on how the project is doing to everyone who needs to be informed, those folks can just get their information. And if they need to intervene to help to make some sort of decision or give some feedback, they can show up at our next meeting, but they don't need to be there every time because they're guaranteed that they can just look at the dashboard and see how we're doing, right? And so small batches, again, make it harder for work to get stuck in queues. So that's another way that small batches are important. The capacity planning is sort of one of my favorites, especially with large organizations. It's really a problem because folks tend to be matrix and spread across many different projects. And so it's really hard to get a sense of how much capacity we actually have, right? You can't achieve more than your capacity allows, no matter who is asking for it. It doesn't matter if it's the CEO or the board or anybody else. You can only do how much you can do, right? And so one thing that's really helpful is to try and measure your capacity by taking a sample over a period of time and seeing on an average week or month, we were able to accomplish X, Y, and Z, and that's our capacity. Of course, you can increase your capacity gradually over time using things like a Kanban system or other kinds of continuous improvement, but it's not overnight. Like right now, we only have so much capacity. And so if you try to give us more work than we have capacity for, it's going to slow the whole system down. A system that is already pretty heavily loaded, if you add more load to it, it will actually slow it down exponentially until it crawls to a grinding halt. So one of the big problems we have in a lot of corporations where I go and advise is that there's just too many things being prioritized, right? It's like everybody wants everything, and leadership is not being realistic and honest with themselves about the capacity of their teams. And they try to just sort of push and browbeat and get people to work faster. And that only makes things worse, right? And this last little nugget here is about there's always going to be unplanned work. There will always be emergencies. There'll always be things that pop up. There'll be things that break. And so it's important to plan your capacity, maybe to say only 80% of what you think you're capable of, and leave about 20% unallocated, just so that you can have it available for any unexpected tasks that pop up in the middle of a cycle, right? And when there's no emergencies, that 20% can just be applied to various background improvement housekeeping tasks that need to get done eventually anyway, right? And so small batches make changes in capacity allocation easier as well, right? Then we've got dependencies. Dependencies between teams should be minimized if at all possible. I know it's not completely possible in a large organization, but we should definitely identify all of those dependencies and make sure that we're allowing teams to operate as autonomously as we possibly can. Teams should be dedicated and cross-functional to a particular product or service or process or initiative or value stream as much as possible. Dependencies between teams tend to lock up the system, right? And large batches tend to get stuck in the handoffs between different dependent teams. And so the more dependencies we have in an overall system, the slower everything is going to go. So the real ingenuity in a large organization is looking at the dependencies, and the opportunity for you is where can you eliminate those dependencies, either by synchronizing teams to the same sort of release calendar, if that's possible, or reconfiguring the work so that they can operate and release to customers entirely independently. That would be a great way to do it, right? So small batches will make it easier to manage the dependencies that are left over after you've removed as many as you can. Then we've got number 6, which is reducing handoffs. So handoffs are any time when someone in a process finishes a bunch of work and then hands it to the next person downstream to continue working on that, right? Wherever there's a handoff, there's an opportunity for a queue to form, especially if batch sizes are too large. And where there's a queue, there's going to be delay, and delay costs money. So handoffs are really best avoided. You want to try to get people who are in a sequential set of roles in a process to try to work cross-functionally with the same unit of work down the process, rather than creating batches where they hand things off in more of a waterfall manner, right? Because queues will slow down the whole system. Small batches also make handoffs easier to be more flexible. So if you can't remove a handoff, a small batch will at least make it less painful. And then finally, encouraging fast feedback loops, right? So the most important feedback loop is the one from the customer, but you can have many other feedback loops in the system, making sure the designs are right before you start building something, making sure you've tested it before you release it. Those are all feedback loops. And small batches make feedback loops faster, right? Feedback loops can increase quality by reducing the amount of rework that needs to be done when defects are found. It can speed up the time between when a defect emerges and when you can actually go and fix it, right? And it also gives teams a sense of control so that they can steer more quickly and adapt more quickly if they have those feedback loops. And so finally, just point out that we'd be happy to help you on your Agile journey. Startup Patterns does executive coaching and team coaching and workshops and training, and we can help you figure out how to apply all this stuff in the dirty details if you're ever interested. So just reach out to me.